The silence of the Westmere Valley was usually George's only companion, and he preferred it that way. He had moved to the cabin 3 years ago, escaping a life in the city that felt increasingly like a tightening noose. Here, in the deep thicket of pine and fir, the only deadlines were the setting sun and the oncoming winter. The cabin was sturdy, built of logs as thick as a man's torso, situated 5 miles from the nearest gravel road and 10 from the nearest neighbor. For 3 years, George knew the rhythm of the woods. He knew the chitter of the red squirrels, the heavy crashing of elk through the brush, and the mournful cry of the coyotes that echoed off the valley walls. But on a Tuesday in late November, the rhythm broke. It started with the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping forest, it was a held breath. The birds vanished. The squirrels, usually bold enough to steal crumbs from his porch, were gone. The air grew heavy, static-charged, carrying a scent that made George's stomach turn, a smell like wet copper and rotting meat left in the sun. George sat in his armchair, a book resting forgotten on his lap. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to claw at the walls. The sound came from the front porch. It wasn't the light tap of a branch or the scratch of a raccoon. It was heavy, wet. It sounded like a slab of beef dropped onto the wooden planks. George froze. He reached for the hunting rifle he kept leaning against the stone fireplace. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly. He racked the bolt, the metallic clack-clack sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Hello?" he called out. His voice cracked. "I'm armed." Silence. Then a sound that made the hair on George's arms stand up like wire. It was a sniffing sound. Deep, wet, rattling inhales. It was right at the door. The gap beneath the heavy oak door was small, but in the firelight, George saw a shadow shift there. Something was blocking the draft. He stood up, walking slowly toward the single window that looked out onto the porch. He had boarded up the lower half for insulation, leaving only the top pane clear. He approached it obliquely, hugging the wall, trying to get an angle without revealing himself. The moon was full, a high, pale eye staring down through the skeletal branches of the trees. It illuminated the porch in a bath of cold blue light. George peeked around the frame. At first, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. He tried to categorize it. Bear? No. Wolf? Too big. The creature was crouched on all fours, its back arched high, the spine protruding like a ridge of jagged stones beneath matted, oily fur. It was massive, easily the size of a grizzly, but the proportions were all wrong. The limbs were too long, jointed strangely like a spider's. Then it moved. It didn't just stand up, it unfolded. The sound of popping cartilage and snapping bone filled the air, wet and sickening. The creature rose onto its hind legs, its spine cracking as it straightened. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, towering over the window frame. George clamped a hand over his mouth to stifle a scream. The creature's fur was patchy. In the bald spots, the skin was gray and translucent, pulled tight over ropey muscle. But it was the head that broke George's mind. It was a wolf's head, seemingly. The long snout, the pointed ears, but the jaw was unhinged, hanging loosely. And inside the mouth, pushed forward as if wearing the animal like a suit, was something else. The eyes were not yellow or reflective like a beast's. They were white, human whites with tiny pinpoint pupils, and they were looking directly at him. The creature raised a hand, not a paw, a hand. It was covered in coarse hair and ended in black talons, but the fingers were long, multi-jointed, and dexterous. It reached out and tapped the glass. Tap, tap, tap. It was mocking him. George backed away, raising the rifle. "Get back!" he roared, the fear turning to aggressive panic. The creature didn't recoil. It leaned in closer, pressing its face against the glass. George could see the condensation of its breath fogging the pane. The creature's lips peeled back, revealing gums that were black and oozing. It didn't roar. It didn't howl. It spoke. The voice was a grinding sound, like stones crushing together, layered over a deep, guttural growl. It was trying to mimic human speech, but the anatomy wasn't right. George's knees gave out. He slumped against the far wall, the rifle pointing uselessly at the ceiling. "What are you?" he whispered, tears stinging his eyes. The creature mimicked the sound of his whimper perfectly. It was a parrot from hell. Then it slowly dragged a single talon down the glass, creating a screech that vibrated in George's teeth. It looked at the door handle. George had locked it, dead-bolted it, and barred it. The creature's hand encompassed the doorknob. It turned it gently, testing the mechanism. Finding it locked, the creature didn't batter the door down. It didn't rage. It leaned its forehead against the glass again, staring at George with those horrible, intelligent human eyes. A look of pure malice crossed its face. It wasn't hungry. It was amused. It opened its mouth again, the jaw distending impossibly wide, and let out a sound that wasn't a roar. It was a laugh. A dry, hacking, wheezing laugh that sounded like a dying man choking on blood. Then, with a speed that blurred the air, it dropped to all fours. George scrambled to the window, risking everything to look. The creature was bounding toward the tree line. But it wasn't running like a wolf anymore. It was galloping, its movements jerky and synchronized, too fast, too fluid. It hit the darkness of the trees and vanished. But the sound of that wheezing laughter drifted back on the wind. George sat in the center of his cabin, the rifle clutched to his chest, staring at the door. He threw every piece of furniture he owned against it. He didn't sleep. He didn't blink. When the sun rose, painting the snow in innocent shades of pink and gold, George finally moved. He packed a single bag. He took his keys. He didn't look at the woods. As he stepped onto the porch, the cold morning air biting his face, he stopped. On the frosted glass of the window, right where the creature's breath had fogged the pane, there was a smear of viscous black slime. And scratched into the wood of the doorframe, deep enough to expose the raw grain, were 3 words: "See you soon." George got in his truck and drove. He didn't look in the rearview mirror, but even now, miles away in the safety of a crowded city with streetlights and sirens, George keeps his curtains drawn. Because sometimes, when the wind blows just right, he can hear it. Not a howl, not a growl, but a dry, wheezing laugh scratching at the window of his mind. The locals in the valley below didn't talk about Cragspire Peak with reverence. They talked about it with a hushed, superstitious dread. They called it the Broken Tooth because of the way its jagged granite summit tore at the sky. Anthony, a software architect from the city, didn't care about folklore. He cared about the elevation gain, the isolation, and the silence he needed to drown out the noise of a chaotic divorce. He was an experienced hiker, ultralight gear, packed with obsessive precision. He hit the trailhead at dawn, making good time up the switchbacks. By late afternoon, the tree line was a memory, replaced by a moonscape of gray slate and scrub brush. The air was thin and bit at his lungs, sharp with the scent of pine resin and impending frost. The plan was to camp at the Ridge of Silence, a flat plateau just 2 miles from the summit at sunrise and descend. But as the sun began to dip behind the western range, painting the sky in bruises of purple and blood orange, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't the temperature dropping, it was the sound. The wind, which had been howling through the crags all day, suddenly died. The birds, the ravens that had trailed him for miles, vanished. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like a held breath. Anthony stopped to adjust his pack. That's when he smelled it. It wasn't the clean smell of snow or stone. It was musky, wet, and ancient. It smelled like wet fur, left to rot in a dark cellar, mixed with the metallic tang of copper. "Bear," he whispered to himself, his hand instinctively going to the canister of bear spray on his hip. But bears didn't smell like that. This smell carried a malice that triggered a primal alarm in his hindbrain. He picked up his pace, his boots crunching loudly on the scree. He needed to reach the plateau. The terrain grew steeper, the path narrowing between 2 sheer walls of rock known as the chimney. Snap. The sound came from above him to the left. Anthony froze, scanning the ridgeline. The twilight played tricks on the eyes, turning shadows into shapes. He saw nothing but rock. "Hello?" he called out. His voice sounded small, swallowed instantly by the vastness. No answer. Just the sound of loose gravel sliding down the slope, clattering like bone dice. He pushed on, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He reached the plateau just as the last of the light bled out of the sky. He didn't bother with a fire. He wanted to be invisible. He set up his one-man tent in the lee of a large boulder, ate a cold protein bar, and crawled into his sleeping bag. Sleep was impossible. The smell was back, stronger now. It permeated the nylon walls of the tent. Then came the breathing. It was close. Right outside the thin fabric. It was a wet, rattling rasp, deep and heavy, like a massive bellows. Anthony lay paralyzed, his hand gripping his hiking knife so hard, his knuckles turned white. He watched the moonlight hit the side of the tent. A shadow fell across the luminous fabric. It wasn't a bear. The silhouette was wrong. The shoulders were too broad, tapering down to a narrow waist. The head was elongated, crowned with tufted ears that twitched. It stood on two legs, towering over the tent. Anthony stopped breathing. The creature inhaled, a long, shuddering sniff that vibrated the ground. Then, a low growl started in its chest, a sub-frequency that Anthony felt in his teeth. Zip. The sound of the zipper on his tent fly being tested. A claw, thick as a finger, hooked into the fabric and slowly dragged down. The nylon screamed as it tore. Anthony didn't think. He reacted. He rolled out the backside of the tent, bursting through the unzipped rear flap just as the front of the tent collapsed under massive weight. He scrambled into the darkness, boots slipping on the frost-slicked rocks. He didn't have his pack. He didn't have his bear spray. He only had his knife and his headlamp, which he was too terrified to turn on. Behind him, a sound erupted that stopped his heart. It wasn't a roar, it was a laugh. A guttural, wet, barking laugh that dissolved into a howl. It was the sound of a human vocal cord pushed beyond its limits by a beast's throat. He ran toward the summit. It was the only place to go. The trail down was too exposed. He needed high ground. He needed a crevice. Anthony scrambled up a chimney of rock, tearing his fingernails, bashing his knees. He could hear it behind him. It wasn't running, it was bounding. He could hear the clack, clack, clack of claws on stone, closing the distance with terrifying speed. He crested a ridge and the full moon hit him, illuminating the peak in stark, ghostly white. And there it was. It had flanked him. It stood atop a boulder 10 yards away, silhouetted against the moon. It was a monstrosity of anatomy. 7 feet tall, covered in matted wire-brush fur. Its legs were dog-legged, hocks high and powerful, but its arms were terrifyingly human, long and sinewy, ending in hands with opposable thumbs and scythe-like talons. But the face, that was the horror. The snout was long and wolf-like, dripping with thick saliva, but the eyes were unmistakably intelligent. They were yellow, burning with a sadistic hunger. It wasn't hunting for food, it was hunting for sport. The werewolf threw its head back and let out a sound that shattered Anthony's reality. It wasn't the romantic howl of movies. It was a scream of agony and rage, a sound that spoke of bones breaking and skin tearing. It dropped to all fours and charged. Anthony threw himself to the right, sliding down a steep scree slope. He tumbled, the world spinning in a blur of gray and black. He slammed into a rock shelf. The wind knocked out of him. Above him, the creature skidded to a halt, sending a shower of rocks down. It paced the edge, looking down. Anthony squeezed himself into a narrow fissure in the rock face, a crack barely wide enough for a man. He pressed himself back as far as he could go, the cold stone biting into his back. A massive furred hand reached into the crack. The claws scraped against the stone, inches from Anthony's face. The smell of rot and old blood washed over him, choking him. "I see you," a voice rasped. It wasn't a human voice. It was a gurgle, a mockery of speech formed by a throat not designed for words. "Little meat." Anthony squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. The creature threw its weight against the rock, trying to widen the crack. The mountain groaned. Dust rained down on Anthony's head. The beast snarled, frustrated, and began to dig. Rocks flew. It dug for hours. Anthony spent the night in a fetal ball, shaking violently, listening to the scraping, the sniffing, and the occasional wet, gurgling words that drifted into the fissure. The creature was taunting him. Come out, crack the bone, suck the marrow. Around 3:00 a.m., the temperature plummeted. The digging stopped. Anthony waited. Had it gone? Then a hot, wet breath blasted into the crack. One yellow eye pressed against the opening, staring directly at him. The pupil constricted. Sunrise, the beast whispered. Lucky. With a final frustrated roar that shook dust from the ceiling of the fissure, the creature pulled away. Anthony heard the heavy footfalls retreating, moving up toward the very peak of Cragspire, higher into the desolation. Anthony didn't move for 4 hours. He waited until the sun was high and the shadows were banished. When he finally crawled out, stiff and bruised, the world was blindingly bright. He looked at the rock face. The granite around the fissure was scarred with deep gouges, white scratches in the gray stone where the adamant claws had tried to reach him. He didn't retrieve his tent. He didn't look for his pack. He ran. He ran down the mountain, falling, bleeding, sliding, until he hit the tree line. He didn't stop until he reached his car at the trailhead. He locked the doors and sat there, shivering in the heat of the midday sun. He looked in the rearview mirror. His face was caked in dust and dried blood, his eyes wide and hollow. As he put the car in gear, he looked back up at Cragspire Peak. A single, lonely cloud snagged on the summit, and just for a second, he saw it. A tiny, dark speck standing on the highest pinnacle, watching him leave. Anthony drove away, but he never really left the mountain. At night, in his apartment in the city, he keeps the windows locked and the lights on. Because sometimes, when the wind blows through the alleyways just right, he can hear it, the sound of a zipper being tested. The silence of the mountain at 2 a.m. was not peaceful. It was oppressive. It was a heavy, physical weight that pressed against the windows of the 2014 Honda Civic, demanding to be let in. Kevin gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned the color of old bone. His eyes were burning, dry from the heater, blasting against the windshield to fight off the encroaching fog. Beside him, Apple was drifting in and out of a restless sleep, her head knocking rhythmically against the passenger window as the car navigated the endless, serpentine switchbacks of the Sierra Madre foothills. How much longer? Apple murmured, her voice thick with sleep, not opening her eyes. GPS says 20 minutes until we hit the highway, Kevin said, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would alert the woods to their presence. Just rest. I got this. But he didn't feel like he got this. The high beams were struggling. The fog wasn't just rolling in. It felt like it was exhaling from the asphalt itself. It swirled in hypnotic gray ribbons, catching the light and throwing it back into his eyes. The road flattened out. They were reaching the base, the foot of the mountain where the dense pine forest transitioned into scrub oak and tall, dry grass. This was supposed to be the easy part, the straight shot. Then, the radio cut out. It didn't fade into static. It simply died. The green glow of the display vanished, plunging the cabin into a deeper darkness. Apple sat up, fully awake now. Why did the music stop? Fuse, maybe, Kevin muttered, tapping the dashboard. Old car. Kevin! Apple's tone had changed. It wasn't annoyed, it was sharp, brittle. Slow down. I'm only doing 40. Kevin, stop the car! She screamed. He slammed on the brakes more out of reflex to her scream than seeing the danger himself. The tires shrieked against the damp asphalt, the seatbelts locking tight against their chests. The car skidded slightly, the headlights dipping and bobbing violently before coming to a rest. The engine idled, a low purr that sounded deafening in the sudden stillness. What? Kevin panted, his heart hammering against his ribs. Apple, what the hell? She didn't answer. She was pressing herself back into the seat, her hand clamped over her mouth, a trembling finger pointing through the windshield. Kevin looked. At first, His brain refused to process the geometry of what stood in the middle of the road, barely 20 feet away. The high beams cut through the fog, illuminating a wall of matted, coarse fur. It was immense. That was the first thing Kevin realized, the sheer scale of it. It was crouched on its hind legs, its knuckles resting on the asphalt, like a sprinter at the starting block. But even crouched, its back was level with the hood of their car. "Is that a bear?" Kevin whispered, though he knew it wasn't. Bears didn't have shoulders that rolled with that kind of sickening, muscular fluidity. Bears didn't have hocks that bent backward like a dog's, but thick as tree trunks. The creature slowly stood up. The motion was fluid and horrifyingly human. It rose and rose and rose, until its head was obscured by the darkness above the headlight beams. It had to be 7 feet tall, maybe 8. "Lock the doors," Apple whimpered. The sound was barely audible. "They're locked," Kevin said, his voice trembling. He reached for the gear stick to throw it into reverse, but his hand was shaking so badly he couldn't find the purchase. The creature took a step forward. Thud. The ground seemed to vibrate. It stepped into the full glare of the lights. It was a nightmare made flesh. It was wolf-like, yes, but twisted. The snout was elongated, filled with jagged, yellowed teeth that didn't fit quite right in its jaw, protruding at odd angles. Drool, thick and ropey, dripped from its jowls, steaming as it hit the cold pavement. But it was the eyes that broke Kevin's mind. They weren't the reflective green of a wild animal. They were amber, intelligent, and filled with a cold, ancient malice. They looked human. "It sees us!" Apple cried, tears streaming down her face. "Kevin, drive! Please, just drive!" The creature tilted its head. It let out a sound, not a howl, but a low, chuffing exhale that sounded like a laugh trapped in a flooded lung. Kevin jammed the car into reverse. The gears ground with a horrific metal scream. The noise seemed to trigger it. In a blur of gray and black, the thing moved. It didn't run. It launched itself. "Kevin!" Kevin stomped on the gas, tires spinning on the slick road, smelling of burning rubber. But they weren't fast enough. A massive, clawed hand slammed onto the hood of the Civic. The metal groaned and buckled as if it were tinfoil. The car shook violently, the force of the impact nearly stalling the engine. The creature vaulted onto the hood, its face now inches from the windshield. Apple screamed, a raw, tearing sound. Kevin stared into the amber eyes through the safety glass. He could see the pores on its snout, the scars running across its nose, the hot breath fogging up the glass from the outside. It raised a fist, the claws black and curved like scythes. "Get off!" Kevin roared, fueled by pure reptilian panic. He shifted from reverse to drive and floored it. The car shot forward. The creature lost its balance, its claws screeching across the hood, leaving 4 deep, parallel gouges in the metal. It slid off the side, tumbling onto the road. Kevin didn't look back. He didn't check the mirrors. He kept his foot welded to the floor, the engine whining in protest as the needle climbed past 60, 70, 80. They flew around the curves, tires threatening to lose grip, risking a plunge into the ravine just to get away from the thing on the road. "Is it following?" Kevin shouted, his eyes wide and unblinking. Apple twisted around, looking through the rear window. "I can't see. It's too dark. Just go." They drove in silence for 10 miles. Neither of them breathed fully until they saw the neon glow of a gas station sign near the highway junction. Kevin pulled the car under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the station canopy. He threw the car into park and killed the engine. For a long minute, neither of them moved. The silence returned, but this time, it was the silence of civilization, the hum of a refrigerator inside the store, the distant rush of the highway. "Are you okay?" Kevin asked, his voice cracking. He reached out to touch Apple's arm. She was shaking violently. She didn't answer. She just opened her door and stumbled out onto the concrete. Kevin got out too. He walked to the front of the car. His knees gave out and he had to grab the side mirror to stay upright. The hood of the car was destroyed. It was crushed inward, the metal torn open like wet paper. But it wasn't just the damage. Stuck in the jagged metal of the torn hood, caught on a sharp edge, was a clump of coarse gray fur. And beneath it, smeared across the Honda logo in a thick, dark streak, was blood. But it wasn't red. It was black, viscous, and it smelled like copper and old earth. Kevin looked back at the road they had come from, the darkness of the mountain looming behind them. He thought he saw movement in the tree line, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. "Apple!" Kevin whispered, staring into the dark. "Get in the car!" "Kevin, get in the car!" he screamed. "It's not done!" From the darkness beyond the lights, a low, chuffing laugh drifted on the wind.